Good afternoon, everyone. And before we begin, I'll share a couple of procedural things. Throughout the presentation, please use the question and answer function to pose questions to our speaker, Dr. John Gargani, and we'll make time to discuss your questions at the end of the webinar. There will also be a webinar feedback survey that I will send by email after for all those attending, but also with opportunity to complete the webinar feedback survey with a QR code and link that will be posted. And this webinar, for your information, is also being recorded and will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit this and share this in our previous webinars. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity's webinar series. I'm your host, Jason Novick, AVA Webinar Coordinator and Research Coordinator at the University of Calgary. And on behalf of AVA, I want to begin by acknowledging that on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, and visit, and become engaged allies together. And in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is Scaling Impact, Innovation for the Public Good, featuring Dr. John Gargani, founder and president of Gargani and Company. And Dr. Gargani is an evaluator, researcher, writer, and educator whose work examines how social and environmental impact is created, measured, valued, and scaled. He is co-author with Robert McLean of Scaling Impact, Innovation for the Public Good. As founder and president of Gargani and Company, he has led a diverse international portfolio of evaluation and program design projects for more than 30 years, and his work has been supported by government agencies, foundations, and private investors. His work encompasses early stage innovation design, scaling, and rigorous impact evaluation, including randomized controlled trials. His scholarship aims to strengthen the credibility and usefulness of evidence used to assess impact, determine value, and inform resource allocation. Dr. Gargani holds a PhD in measurement and evaluation from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MS in statistics and operations research from New York University, and an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He has also taught graduate courses at Claremont Graduate University and the University of Pennsylvania, and has delivered professional education internationally for more than 2 decades. Dr. Gargani, welcome to the AVA Webinar Wednesday series, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason. I appreciate the introduction. I fear that the audience may come away thinking that this is going to be an overly conceptual kind of lecture, given the fact that I seem to spend way too much time in school, either as a student or as someone who's teaching. But my objective today is really to do something else and to try to provide you with some guidance on where to begin scaling. Right? Scaling is a pretty complicated thing. When you begin to undertake it, you realize just how much is involved, and it can seem overwhelming. And there's a great deal of, I think, sort of misinformation and misconception about what scaling is and what it could be. So my topic today is really where to begin as somebody who wants to take their organization to some different level of scale that would benefit the people, places, and things that they serve. I really have 4 objectives today, and those are, first of all, just to invite you to adopt a different mindset about scaling, to think about it differently. And I'll, along the way, point out sort of aspects of that. And perhaps you'll let me know whether I'm describing something that is different and whether this seems like something that is reasonable or not. I also want to direct you to places where you can read and learn more about scaling, all free of charge. So there are great many resources, some of which I've been a part of developing, that are available for free. And so I'm going to show you where you can get those. Again, I want to suggest some simple first steps that you can take to start scaling. And then fourth, I also want to reveal a little bit about the complexity of scaling. I don't want you to walk away thinking that it is just a very simple set of things that you can do, that there's complexity lurking in the back. But I don't want to really overwhelm you with that today. All right, let's get started. Like many people, uh, I really need a cup of coffee to get started in the morning. And a cup about this size, yeah, I mean, that's okay. But a larger cup like this, well, that would certainly be better. And a cup this size, well, yeah, now we're starting to get somewhere. And oh yeah, like this is even better, right? And this logic that if there's something that's good, more of it would be better is a lot of what drives thinking about scaling. But if we take that thinking too far, we end up racing to try to create, the world's largest cup of coffee, a Godzilla-sized cup of coffee. So this notion that bigger is better is always lurking in the background of scaling. And, you know, is bigger better? Well, I think as a general rule, if we're going to come up with a rule here, a better rule would simply be that better is better, right? Better is something that people will disagree on. People won't disagree on bigger so much, but they will disagree on better. And we begin to see some of the complexity in scaling right there. If I limit myself to thinking about a cup of coffee simply in terms of how much of it I drink, then it certainly would be better to drink a cup of coffee this size than one that's Godzilla size. If I even attempted to drink that cup of coffee, I would get very sick and possibly kill myself, right? So there is sort of a limit on how much is not just good enough, but how much is best. And that idea is captured in this notion of being optimal, that being optimal is best. And optimal here, what we mean is we want to consider many things, not just how much of something there is or how big it is or how big its consequences are. But there are qualitative aspects to this, right? What is the quality of the coffee? What is the sustainability of the cup that it's presented in, right? So optimal really might look something like this, which is quite different than just a larger cup of coffee. But in thinking about that, again, people will disagree in different contexts, in different settings. Optimal might be a giant cup of coffee, the one on the left, or it may be the smaller cup of coffee in a glass cup that's of a higher quality to the right. So scaling presents a lot of choices like this. And we have many choices about how we go about scaling and what we scale. But we don't seem to have much in the way of a strongly developed understanding as to how to frame those questions, how to answer them, and really who should be given the responsibility of answering them and who should be participating in asking and answering them. All of that was floating around in our heads when Rob and I decided we wanted to write this book, Scaling Impact Innovation for the Public Good. Scaling was becoming more and more popular, and we were finding that the kinds of approaches to scaling we were seeing in practice and in the literature were leaving us underwhelmed. Something seemed to be missing. And we often were finding cases where scaling was unfolding in ways that we could definitely point at and say, that's not right. That's not what we want. For example, this photograph was shared by some colleagues at Engineers Without Borders. And I don't know a lot about the context, except that this is a village. And in this village, 3 different organizations came in, each one drilling a different well. So there are 1, 2, 3 wells in this village. Each one of the organizations that drilled this well was given a mandate to scale. Each one was measuring how well it was scaling by how many wells it drilled. And each one reported that, we're doing a great job scaling. Yet 3 wells in one village probably is unnecessary and almost certainly is preventing some other village that needs a well from having one. So this is a case where there's a lot of scaling going on, but we're not really scaling the impact of these efforts. This is a pretty clear example of something that is not successful scaling, which raises the question, what is successful scaling? So Rob and I wanted to try to answer that question when we wrote the book, and we felt that the best source was to go to the people who were actually trying to do scaling. In particular, we ended up basing our book on the work of Southern innovators with whom we interacted, interviewed, as well as decades of work that was done at IDRC, which is where Rob works. All of that is now available for free, that work, and it's continuing to grow. At the IDRC, there's a page on scaling science. So for Rob and me, like the whole idea of understanding how to scale and scaling well, that is scaling science. And so on this page, there are places where you can get access to our book for free. There's a link there, some other articles, a playbook, and most recently, what's available for free is a whole course on scaling impact. So you can hit this button and enroll for free, and it's known as a MOOC, a massive online course, and you can learn much more about scaling as it's presented in the book. And you get to see people who are actually trying to engage in scaling around the world talk about those efforts and how they're succeeding and where they're struggling. So the book came out just at the end of 2019, just in time for us to go out and begin to publicize it and then have to go home because of COVID. So there's, I think for us, the primary purpose of this book is to suggest a different mindset that one can adopt when undertaking scaling. And we've organized that nudge towards a different way of thinking around 4 principles and 5 case studies. So I'm going to talk more about the principles in a bit, but I think we should take a look at just what those case studies are. So one is on scaling a program, an eco-health program for Chagas disease prevention in Central America. Another on scaling access to justice for survivors of sexual violence in India. There's scaling salt reduction policies and programs in Latin America. And scaling Southern policy research to a global level with something called Southern Voice. And then there's scaling a nutrition intervention in the market by promoting locally fortified sunflower oil using e-vouchers. And so we chose these intentionally to be quite diverse. And they don't even properly capture the full diversity of efforts that are trying to scale. And as you go and read them, I think you'd be struck by those differences. For example, the cases describe different things that create impact. I use things because we don't actually have a very good word for this. In my world, a lot of those things are called innovations, but in your world, they might be called programs. And in other areas of work, they might be products or services or policies or investments, right? So the thing that's creating the impact has oftentimes different names depending on the domain. And oftentimes there's not one thing, there's some collection of those things put together that we're trying to use to create impact. The second is they differ in their scaling strategies. And I think we'll have enough time to talk more about what I mean by that. But, just briefly, you could be trying to reach more people with a service, or you could be trying to improve the quality of the service to the people you already serve. Both of those are strategies for scaling the impact of what you're doing. But then there are scaling mechanisms. In the book, they're referred to as pathways, I tend not to call them that outside of the book because this notion of scaling pathways gets used in many different ways. But the mechanisms are the more concrete, tactical ways that you're trying to make scaling work. So, for example, you might be trying to reach more people with your service, but you could do that by increasing the capacity of your organization to serve people, or you could do that by trying to embed your program as a matter of policy at the state or national level, right? And so those are two different mechanisms for trying to implement a strategy. And then there are scaling effects. These are a rather strange things, scaling effects. These are the kind of non-linear, often unanticipated consequences of scaling itself. So we're not really going to dive into scaling effects much today. But ever since COVID, we've all become experts on one scaling effect, which is called herd immunity, right? So if you inoculate enough people within a community, then at some point, enough people are inoculated that they begin to protect those who are not. And that is called herd immunity. And so for every next vaccination, you're actually able to have a larger impact. And that continues to grow in a nonlinear way up to some point. And that's a scaling effect. That's an effect of scaling. It's not an effect of the vaccine itself. And then finally, the last thing is an optimal result. Just like the fact that we don't want to suddenly brew the world's largest cup of coffee when we're trying to scale the impact of our work. We're looking for some optimal results, something that balances the good and the bad and the cost and the quantity and the quality. All of that we're trying to balance into something that is optimal. Now, those five elements I think, are quite useful things to keep in mind because you can put them together to come up with a kind of rudimentary scaling theory of change, which looks different than a typical theory of change because we're trying to talk about why scaling is going to produce this optimal result. And so, you've got these five elements. You've got to somehow describe the things that create the impact, the scaling strategies, the mechanisms, the scaling effects, and then the optimal result. And then explain how they are all connected and why it is that all of these things will eventually culminate in this kind of optimal result. So, for example, if you're the Acme Food Program and you're trying to provide nutritional support to community, well, you might choose a strategy where you scale out to new communities, right? So you're going to go out and implement this program in different communities. The mechanism might be a kind of franchising model where you teach other people to implement the program and they implement it and you share branding and you share resources and learning, right? And so that's a kind of franchising model. And there might be a scaling effect, which is a kind of ordering effect. Perhaps you're choosing the communities that you will work in next because they're the ones with the greatest need, which means as you move to the next community and the one after that, you might expect that your impact declines with each new community. But that's not a function of the program becoming less effective. It's a function of the way you've decided to go about scaling. So that's a scaling effect. And then the optimal result would be defined by what's good that's coming out of this effort. What kind of harm when we operate at this particular level and in this particular way. And then there's also a stopping rule, right? At some point, you need to stop. At some point, the cup of coffee is the right size and the right vessel and the right way, right? So you're not trying to make the largest program you can make, trying to make the optimal program to create the optimal impact. And so you need to know when and how to stop. Something that's, I think, very important to keep in mind and is often forgotten by people who want to undertake scaling is that you have many, many ways to go about scaling the same thing. So you could develop a whole other scaling theory of change that explains how the Acme Food Program decides to use a strategy of improving its quality in order to be embedded in national policy, right? Like that's a whole other way of trying to scale the impact of this work. The scaling effects would also be different. Like in this case, you might have a problem of crowding out other funding. Maybe that's a problem, maybe it's not a problem, but it would be a consequence of the scaling, not a consequence of the program itself. And it would have a different configuration of what's good, what's harmful, and what kind of stopping rule you might have to come up with. So this idea that you can kind of list 5 things, you can sort of fill it in, you can talk about how they're connected and tell a story that's hopefully logical and supportable by evidence and theory is really, I think, a pretty easy place to start for many organizations. You may find that there are many questions that you can't answer or certain links you can't support. And that's quite useful to know, right? That tells you something about where you need to learn more, find partners who can help you to implement or think about what you're doing. Underneath this sort of simple list of 5 things, there is, of course, some complexity lurking that's even deeper, right? Whatever it is you're doing, your program, your service, your product, well, that's interacting with your strategies, your scaling effects, the mechanisms, all of that is interacting in a rather complex way. And it's the totality of that at any given moment in any given context that's producing the result. The result itself also has this potential to affect all of the other elements that are affecting it. Right? So there's this dynamic interplay between all of these elements, which is quite difficult to conceptualize and to monitor. It's particularly difficult to anticipate. So anyway, along the way, there's this complexity that's kind of hidden from view. And the question that lingers is always, whatever result you're getting, is this optimal? Is this closer to optimal? Have we changed our mind about what optimal is given what we've seen? So all of this is taking place, and you're managing this when you're scaling. And that's in many ways what makes scaling so difficult. But knowing that that's there, knowing that there's this complexity, this bit of the iceberg you don't see, helps prepare you for it and helps you when you start to engage in scaling to begin to ask better questions and to look in better places for evidence of what's going on. Now, scaling is usually chunked up into phases, bits, or stages because it's just the practical way to do things. And it's extremely practical when you're starting off small with limited experience scaling some kind of intervention or program. So let's say, for example, you're operating right now with one program, and you might say, okay, well, we're in phase 1 of our scaling efforts. Underneath that is some particular configuration of the kind of program that you're implementing and how you're trying to improve its quality and its reach and the impacts that are produced from that. And you have a particular set of mechanisms and scaling effects that you're trying to use to your advantage. Right? So that's sort of the beginning, and that might be quite simple to explain. And at some point you might say, well, we're going to move to regional programs, more than one, and we're going to work regionally, which is a pretty large shift from working from one program. So that involves making a decision to actually work at this regional level. And that decision requires you to gather information, requires you to confer with stakeholders of all kinds, in particular, the people who are affected by what you do, and to come up with some criteria that will help you decide whether or not moving to this plan of having regional programs will actually make impact better in some way. Once you make that decision, should you make that decision, then there's a period of transition, which is really quite difficult for many organizations, right? They have to manage the transition to working in one program to working with regional programs. And underneath that regional program, there's actually a whole new theory of change and a whole new set of relationships that weren't there before. So as you're moving from one phase to the next, you're actually probably moving from one theory of change to another, right? The actual thing that you're looking to be producing the impact will almost certainly be different in phase 2. right? So before, maybe you had one program, you were implementing it as you always had. Now you need to also include in what you do to create impact. Well, like, how do I train other people to do this? How do I situate what we do in a way that takes into account the new context that we're in and make adjustments based on that? These are things you never had to do before. So even just the core work of the organization shifts. But also you may use a different scaling strategy. There may be different mechanisms. There may be different scaling effects. And this keeps going, right? You might decide, well, we're going to go from regional to state policy. You've got a whole other decision to make, which may require different kinds of information at different periods of time, a whole different kinds of transition. Moving from regional to state will look a lot different from moving from one program to the next. And you've got a whole other theory of change and set of relationships that are undergirding all of that. So this is a good way to convince people not to scale because I make it so complicated. But really, you can start with some very small steps and learn what's involved with this for the kinds of work that you do and in the context where you work. And I think a great place to start, the very best first step, is to ask yourself, what is your maximum capacity for high quality work under current circumstances? Right? So given how we work now, given where we work and with whom we work, what is our maximum capacity for high quality work? Then develop a plan to achieve that. Right? That is, if you achieve that, you've scaled your impact. It's a kind of baby step scaling impact, but it's an important one. Then put that plan into action. And as you do that, you'll begin to understand the kinds of capacities that your organization will need to develop and the sorts of challenges you'll be facing as you perhaps scale in another way in the future. And I feel like this is a great way for organizations to begin scaling, to do it now, to do it proactively. It doesn't necessarily require you to take on more work, though it may. And even if you choose never to scale, you've probably improved something about your organization already. But you're also, by making it proactive, you're not coming to this the way a lot of organizations that I work with come to it. Someone has funded them to scale. And they never really thought about scaling until this grant came along that they can now use to scale. And they don't have much foundation in the organization that's going to support a scaling effort. So start small, start early, and let that help you devise ambitions around what scaling should look like for you. So maybe this is a good place to pause and just sort of give you a chance to catch your breath and ask me some questions. Again, my objective here is to be able to give you some advice about where to start scaling. That's relatively easy, even though it's a complex problem that can get you started, and that I think can also help you learn about how to scale and become expert at scaling. Any questions or thoughts or comments?
I haven't seen any questions come in the Q&A. I do have a few at the end, but if anyone would like, of course, feel free to post any questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, we'll have more time at the end for sure. But it's always good to stop along the way.
Yeah.
All right, well, we can keep going if no one has anything to ask right now. Perhaps that means that I've been incredibly clear, or it means just the opposite. So you'll let me know later, the Q&A. Well, the picture I'm painting around scaling, I think, tends to look different than the way it's often portrayed. In the world of scaling as it exists in many sort of journal articles and PDFs floating about on the internet, scaling tends to look something like this, where there's a question about how we can make the world better. People do a lot of research and evaluation. They do pilot studies. They do very rigorous kinds of impact analysis. And then, boom, it's proven, right? We've proven that this thing works. And now we're told once we've proven it, we have to scale what works. And what I'm arguing is that even if we know that something seems to be working well in a particular context, at a particular level or type of scale, once we move to start scaling that, right? Once we're trying to reach more people or different people or improve the quality of what we're doing, we almost certainly end up doing something which is different from what we were doing before. And that different thing is being received by the world in a different way. So rather than really sort of scaling what works, which sounds like there isn't much uncertainty about what will happen when we scale, I think it's better to think about scaling really as stepping into the unknown. And that's not something that we should be afraid of or that we should avoid, but we can prepare for that step into the unknown. And it's more likely for us to be successful if we do. And one way to prepare is to prepare the organization for that. Right? If you can build your organization's capacity to navigate the unknown, then you build your organization's capacity to scale. So this is another great place to start for organizations. How do we build our capacity to scale? By being able to navigate the unknown. And there's, I think, a fairly simple schema that you can use to think about this. There are three activities that sit at the heart of an organization's scaling efforts. They also sit at the heart of any organization's efforts, period. There's planning what we're going to do, there's managing what we're going to do, and there's evaluating it. Right? Those three things are pretty much foundational to work in the social and environmental sectors. Now, back when our grandparents were trying to make the world a better place, they did it something like this. They would plan something. Then once it was planned, someone else would go off and manage it. And then after it was all managed, then someone else would come in and evaluate it and tell them how they did. I might call this version one of how organizations operated. And, it's all right, but we quickly learned that doing it in this way and waiting to evaluate to the end maybe wasn't the best thing that we could do. So somewhere along the line, version two came in, where we're going to plan, then we manage, and we evaluate. The evaluation informs the planning, and we have a kind of cycle, right? This cycle over and over and over again. And that's a very common way, some variation of this, of describing how we use information to be effective. That's version two. What I would like to suggest is that there's actually a version three that is much more suited to scaling. And version three looks like this, right? We plan, we manage, and we evaluate all the time, right? We're never not doing those three things. Our emphasis may change, right? At some periods of time, we may be doing more planning than managing, but we're always doing all three. And there's no hierarchy to them, and there's no order in which they're being done, right? These are always informing each other, so that the planning is informing the evaluation is informing the planning is informing the management, which is informing the planning and evaluation and so forth. Like they're always informing each other. And developing an organization's capacity to do these three things continuously and have them quickly provide information to each other and respond to that, that's at the key of being able to step into the unknown well and navigate. Right? So this is a simple way, I think, to think about it. Maybe when an organization is very small, there's one person who's doing all three of these things. But finding a way to do this and for that capacity to develop as you scale uh, has, at least in my experience, been a very big part of predicting which kinds of organizations scale successfully and which ones don't. Okay. Maybe another good place to take just a quick breather before we move on to the next bit of things. I want you all to reform your organizations. That can't be the least bit controversial, right?
Well, I haven't seen any questions coming in the chat yet, but if anyone has questions, please let us know.
Yeah. I can tell I'm working with a Canadian audience because they're very polite and listening, as opposed to an American audience where they would start asking questions before you begin to speak. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, all right, I'm going to go on then. So, because scaling is this effort to step into the unknown where there's some complexity that's never fully revealed to you, Rob and I spent a lot of time thinking about like what kind of guidance can we give organizations that want to scale. And as we spoke with innovators in the global South, they actually had a lot to say about that. And from from their various interactions with us and the research that we did, we distilled 4 principles, which we thought was really the best way to think about how to provide guidance for people who want to scale. And like all principles, I mean, they only get you so far, but they do help you to see where to ask questions. They help you to see what issues are important. So principle 1, which we lay out in the book, is justification. So scaling is a choice, right? You don't have to scale. You may feel like there's this scaling imperative or everybody's scaling and you have to scale too, but it is a choice. And because that choice affects other people, it should be shared with them, right? Like good organizations share that choice with the people who are affected. And they base their decisions on evidence, but also on values. What is important to people? What is good? What is the right way to balance trade-offs? People are going to disagree on the values part more than they're going to disagree on the evidence part. And so that's an aspect of scaling that is difficult. But you need to be able to go to the people who are affected by what you do and justify your decision to scale. And the evidence and the values become that justification. Now, the reason we make this our first principle is because much of what we read and much of the conversations we have with people about scaling start with, well, how do we scale? How are we going to scale? And the first question really should be, should you scale? Right? Should you be scaling? Should you be scaling this at all? Should you be scaling this right now? Should you be scaling this particular way? And the reason we should be asking this should question is because of something which is known as impact risk. Impact risk is the risk that organizations fail to produce impacts that stakeholders desire and or produce impacts that stakeholders find undesirable. Right? That's impact risk. We don't produce the good things we set out to produce, or you end up producing some bad things along the way that nobody wants. And as you scale, as the scaling effort gets, say, more comprehensive. You're trying to reach more people in more ways. This balance between the sort of good and the bad also becomes more complex. You're usually not just producing one good thing. There are many consequences of our actions. Understanding them becomes hard. And once we understand them, it's hard to know what the right configuration of them should be. So we should take a moment to be clear in our own mind and in the minds of all the people that we're affecting about what we're trying to achieve and what seems reasonable and what's optimal. Now, there are different reasons why there's impact risk. One is we fail to scale what works, and this gets a lot of attention among those who are scaling advocates. From their perspective, we have an overabundance of interventions that have evidence that are worth scaling up, but we're not. And so this is a kind of impact risk where we're not producing the good that we should. Another is that we scale what fails to work, right? We're scaling the wrong things up. We may be scaling too early, or we may be misreading the evidence, or the contexts in which we're working are so different from those in which prior work was done that they don't apply. So that's another way that that explains impact risk. We could also fail at the work of scaling. Right? We may have a real winner, but scaling is complicated and hard. And when we go to implement it, it may be that we don't implement it the right way. Right? So there's also this problem of implementation failure of scaling. Now, untangling those three can be quite difficult, and people are often, I would say, too willing to throw out a good idea as thinking that it doesn't work, when it could simply be that we've chosen the wrong context, or the organizations that were doing it needed greater support or training before they went and did the scaling. So there's a fourth reason, and that fourth reason is, surprise, right? It doesn't look like the others. It's just surprise. We're stepping into the unknown. Things are going to happen that we have no idea could happen, that we don't anticipate is happening. So there's a lot of surprise that takes place when you're scaling. And that's also another contributor to impact risk. So the risk shouldn't lead us to think we shouldn't scale. It should lead us to scale with the appropriate level of caution, planning, and evidence to begin with. The second principle is optimal scale, which we've discussed briefly. So more is not always better. Sometimes it's better, but better is better. And when we're trying to make sense of what is better or best or optimal, we should take a more holistic view than simply looking at quantity or reach. Now, we divide the kinds of things we could look at into four categories. There's nothing magical about them. They're just an easy way to think about them. You could have more than four. You could call them different things. That's really not the issue. But four factors when we think about deciding, are we producing a good result, would be one, magnitude. That's, again, what tends to get most of the attention. How much, how many, to what degree, over what geographic area. But there's also variety. As organizations scale, as they change what they do to scale, different kinds of impacts become possible that weren't possible before. And certain kinds of impacts that were possible before now become much harder to achieve or even impossible. So the variety of impacts can change as we scale. Equity, that is who wins and who loses, well, that also changes as we scale, as does sustainability. And we kind of use that word to mean two different things. One aspect of sustainability is maybe the one that most people first go to. That when you scale, you're going to have repercussions on sort of the planet oftentimes that are important to consider. But also, as we scale, the sustainability, the impacts change, right? Like their durability, their ability to last may change. They might last longer. They might last for a shorter period of time. So So anyway, these four kinds of dimensions, uh, we think if you're trying to balance out what is optimal, considering these four get you a lot closer to being able to ask questions about what's optimal and to define what that is for your particular purposes and contexts and stakeholders. And now there's coordination. So we're usually scaling in complex systems. And because we're scaling in these phases in different ways, we probably have an evolving set of actors, right? Different organizations that are helping us, others that maybe are competing against us. And so that's evolving. So we're going to need a flexible scaling process to get through that. We can't just plan it on day one and then implement it. So a lack of coordination really goes a long way to explaining why three different organizations would each drill a well in one village. Right? That's a lack of coordination right there. And in the book and in the um, online course, we talk a bit about mapping the scaling system, about thinking about who else is working within this system and how we develop strategies to work with them or avoid their influence if they're going to be working against us. The last principle is around dynamic evaluation. So scaling is an intervention. We talk a lot about scaling an intervention, but scaling itself is an intervention because we change what we do in order to change impacts, right? Like we're doing something different in order to create a different result. So it is an intervention in its own right. Now, what makes it difficult to understand the relationship between what we're doing when we scale and the consequences of scaling is that scaling creates dynamic change. I gave you a sort of a brief view of that when talking about the scaling theory of change and how the elements interact. There's a very often complicated dynamic between the consequences of scaling and the context in which we're working and the kinds of opportunities and options we have to scale. So all of that is kind of affecting each other constantly. And that's why it's particularly critical to scale before, during, and after our efforts to scale. Evaluate before, during, and after scaling. And so we could have just called it evaluation, but we decided to call it dynamic evaluation to just kind of clue people into the fact that what they're evaluating is different and it has a different kind of urgency to it. Now, a great place to start with this, and there's a lot I could say about that because I'm quite interested in that, but it's an organization trying to start off scaling. I think this idea that you could start by just like, why don't we develop criteria to decide if we should scale? That's a great place to start. And then why don't we develop some criteria to choose how to scale, right? We've got more than one way. How would we decide what's good? Then we could develop some criteria to evaluate how well we scaled. Now we've got these three sets of criteria. It didn't really cost us anything to develop them, or at least come up with a kind of draft of what they would be. And then we come in to ask ourselves, okay, how are the criteria different from each other and how are they similar? And how can we use them to develop a kind of evaluation plan that would support our scaling efforts? What would that look like? So it's a pretty easy place to start to just develop these three kinds of criteria. Should we scale? How should we scale? And how well did we scale? And then use that as a kind of jumping off point for the kinds of evaluation work we would do to support scaling. And finally, I guess to wrap up, I'm going to talk about scaling strategies and that there are many different kinds. And this is not something that anyone ever needs to memorize or know all the particular names for. In fact, the terms that I'm going to use will be different from the terms other people use. There's very little standardization of language around scaling. Uh, but it's good to recognize how many different ways an organization could go about changing the way they work in order to make their impacts better for stakeholders and to achieve some optimal result. Probably the term that people hear most is scaling up. And if we use a simple metaphor of an apple tree, we could then describe scaling up as growing a larger tree with more apples. That's scaling up. And we can contrast that to scaling out, which would be more like growing many trees, each one producing apples. So organizations scale up when they try to serve more people with the kinds of approaches and resources they have, but they might scale out if they decide to work in new sites and new communities and new places, right? And that's the difference between scaling up and scaling out. Scaling deep is about looking to the quality of what you're doing. It's nurturing that tree so that it produces larger and more delicious fruit. Right? That's also scaling impact. The impact has changed. It has gotten better, is increased in some sense, but perhaps most importantly, it's qualitatively improved. Now we can combine these. We can scale up, out, and deep at the same time. We can combine as many of these as we want. So scaling up, out, and deep, those are the terms that you hear a lot, but there are many other kinds of scaling strategies. For example, there's transformational scaling, where you're taking a tree and you're not trying to turn it into an orchard, but you're trying to create more trees that somehow are now a forest, an entirely different kind of system. And then there's viral scaling, where, you have one effort that bears fruit that then creates two new trees, and each of those efforts bear some fruit that create more trees. In terms of an organization, that might be something like a train the trainers model. You train 10 people to perform the service that is important, and they go off and train 10 people, and those train 10 people, and so on. That's a kind of viral scaling. We're also usually not scaling just one thing, but bundles or packages. So we could have the tree, we could have some education about how to tend that tree, and then funding. It's those things together, the bundle that allows us to scale impact. There's horizontal scaling, which is taking something that we know and extending it to increase the variety of impacts that we can create. So we know how to grow trees, but we don't have to grow just apple trees. We could grow green apple trees and pear trees and so forth, right? And so if you're providing one kind of service for individuals, you could extend that to other. You could serve youth. Then there's vertical scaling. Sometimes that's called scaling along the value chain. And here metaphorically, it's like, we're going to produce the seeds to grow the trees, and then we're going to sell these, right? So you could get involved in training the kinds of people who work in your organization, and then also as a way of kind of like essentially the equivalent to the seeds. Or you could go back and look at many of the factors that produce a problem that you're trying to solve and try to address those while also producing the problem should it arise. Right? That's a kind of vertical scaling where you're looking at the cause and effect relationships and intervening along that whole path. Then there's concentric scaling, right? So if you're trying to grow trees that produce fruit, trying to run a program that serves people, you know something about also how to manage that. Or you know something about how to select people to be a part of that program and so forth. It could be that rather than trying to scale the effort of what you're doing, maybe scale your knowledge about how to do that. And that becomes how you scale. Then there's same scaling, which is a decision to just keep doing what you've been doing because you think that's the right or best thing to do. And then there's descaling, which is a decision to do less of what you've been doing, or perhaps stop altogether. And finally, there's false scaling, which is something that has all of the kind of superficial look and feel of scaling, but has none of the consequences. You're not really scaling impact, but you're just doing more and have more effort and are working in more places. But nothing is actually improving because of that. In fact, things may be getting worse. Why do I care about all this? Because just to understand the variety of ways that you could be involved in scaling, I think for many people is news that they don't know that they could do that. And a lot of the work that I end up doing with individuals and organizations is working out the different ways they could be scaling a particular program or innovation that they have, and developing ways to choose among that menu of choices, and then to also go on and how to manage implementing it and evaluate it. All right. So I think this is probably a good time to check in again and see where things are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for guiding us through your scaling impact framework today. And does anyone have questions that they would like to post in the Q&A? Well, I'd really like to thank you because I believe that your emphasis on carefully mapping the things that create impact against the potential effects of scaling strategies is timely in the realm of service provision for those affected by gender-based violence and at the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity. And it's an important context to remember that our responsibility is to ensure that the mechanisms that we choose are truly aligned with the safety and dignity of the communities are served within the realm of gender-based violence and also other areas. And you've given us a lot of important knowledge to use as we navigate these complex transitions, and we're deeply grateful for your insights and your commitment to this important work. And is it fine if I pose some questions of my own, or did you have a
Sure.
concluding slide?
Go ahead. Ask questions.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So, specifically, a core objective of AVA is to break down silos between community agencies, academics, and policymakers. And I appreciate your attentiveness to scaling across silos in the social sector.
Mhm.
And specifically, I'm wondering, in your experience with scaling social intervention, what is the most significant barrier that you've encountered, and how can this be overcome?
So just to be clear, when you're talking about silos, do you mean organizations that are sort of doing their own work on related issues that are not interacting with each other? Or are you talking?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. So I think this is a huge problem, right? Because scaling isn't something best undertaken alone. If you're really trying to scale the impact of something, if you're trying to take a problem which is endemic and somehow make it rare or even make it go away, you're probably not going to do that all on your own, right? You're going to need to work with others. And so finding the right mix of organizations to work with at the different stages of scaling that you're engaged in is really critical for success. But not everyone sees those collaborative efforts as benefiting them. Uh, it has financial impact on them. A lot of organizations would rather pursue efforts on their own because they feel that it's going to be more, they can attract more funding themselves that way. Uh, so I think that the financial aspect of it is really an unfortunate barrier to this, right? You're set out to compete for funding with organizations to be better off collaborating with, and each organization potentially getting a little less funding along the way to make that work. So I'd say the best way to one of the important ways that you can increase that kind of collaboration is to be able to figure out how you can get the resources you need so that everybody wins at an organizational level while trying to solve this at a kind of community level as well. The other is to look for complementary organizations. You're not necessarily trying to find other organizations that do exactly the same thing. So as you're scaling, like you may need to train more people to do what you do. And so it may make sense to collaborate with people who know how to train, right? Because they have the resources and the skills for that. So finding that complementary match can also be a way to sort of break down the silos. Uh, but yeah, I don't have a single answer that solves that problem, unfortunately.
Well, that's very valuable insight with regard to scaling across silos in the social sector. I appreciate your valuable insight. And I'm also wondering about the role of systemic change. And if we consider scaling impact for the public good, how do you determine the point at which an organization should shift its focus from scaling its own successful program, that is, if its program was successful, a shift to advocating for structural or policy level changes?
Yeah. Well, first, they may not be mutually exclusive, right? So it may be better to work on both fronts at the same time. Um, uh, yeah, this some of this is about time and attention of staff, and especially when organizations are smaller, they may not have staff who are dedicated to sort of looking out across all the possibilities of how they can work, right? You have a particular model, you use it, it works well. There could be somebody else who has another model that seems to work really well. And maybe the best thing you could do would be to adopt their model, right? Because they actually have an innovation, something which is superior. And some of the work I do where we work with innovators who are trying to find that better way, a real barrier is having a way that works up to some degree and then deciding to change that. If you have some proprietary feel for that effort that you're currently undertaking, it gets a lot harder to convince somebody to adopt an innovation that's not their own. Um, so I think that it's a lot of effort of um, uh, working with other organizations with similar goals and developing a community in which they can be discussing what is best. And you can therefore sort of speed the rate at which consensus is developed around what is the quote unquote best way to go about solving a problem in a particular context for a particular cost. All right. And that helps you, I think, get there. But people are slow to change and take on an innovation for a variety of reasons. Um, uh, but I think one of them is that they have this proprietary feel to what they're doing now, right? That how they're going about solving the problem is part of their identity and their brand, and that is hard for people to give up, even if they can see the benefit of it. That actually also
Absolutely.
wasn't a very good answer, was it?
No, I thought it was. I thought it was very insightful with respect to how you believe that it is possible for within the realm of scaling for the public good that an organization scaling its own program could potentially occur at the same time as which structural and policy level changes occur, and that these aren't mutually exclusive. So thank you so much. This is very insightful for delving into detail about this. And I'm also wondering about scaling quality versus quantity because I referenced one of your slides which shows how improving program quality is a distinct strategy from scaling out to new communities. So I'm wondering specifically how this framework could be used to argue that improving quality is in itself a form of high value scaling that is just as if not more impactful than, say, the geographic expansion of a program or, say,
Yeah.
reaching an increased number of participants.
Yeah, I guess I've sort of two things to say about that. Like the first is, what we're trying to scale is the impact, right? We're trying to make that, when we say we're scaling the impact, what we really mean is the impact has become better somehow because of our scaling efforts. And it could be better because more people receive it. And it could be better because it is actually better. It affects them more deeply or in more ways. And so when you think about scaling in terms of the consequences of scaling and not the means by which you scale, then I think it's pretty easy to see how improving effectiveness and improving efficiency are ways of scaling impact. The other is that even if you only focused on something that was kind of quantitative, like how many people I reach or how big the impact is or my geographic spread, you will be changing what you do qualitatively. You're almost certainly not able to engage in exactly the same kind of effort when you scale. You're going to have to change what you do to make it possible to reach more people or work in more places. So if you're going to change what you do, you might as well be taking the effort, make a slightly smaller incremental effort to be changing what you do in a way that improves overall the effect. Doesn't just accommodate the scaling, but actually improves the effect of the program itself. So I think quantity and quality, they go together. It's difficult to think about how you change one and never change the other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for providing these insights regarding, for example, how improving qualitatively the effectiveness of a program could also go hand in hand with its quantitative expansion and quantitative assessment of effectiveness. And my final question relates to the slide which you had shared early on in your webinar related to the bidirectional effects between scaling mechanisms and things that create impact and scaling strategies and scaling effects. And
Mhm.
specifically, I'm interested in the arrows that connect scaling mechanisms and also scaling effects to the result. And specifically, this suggests that effects are ongoing variables, and specifically within the realm, applying this to the work that Alliance Against Violence and Adversity undertakes, how do you believe we could best design early warning feedback loops into our scaling plans so that negative systemic effects are caught before they become the final result, or even just in general for any social organization? Thank you for pulling up the slide, by the way.
You're welcome. So yeah, so what you're getting at is what I believe is a very important aspect of scaling. Um, there's a kind of classic story arc about scaling that starts with, the humble beginnings in the garage of a thing that's then created and, everyone loves it and it makes everyone's life better and it becomes very successful and it's widely used. Then eventually everyone's like, oh my God, this actually has negative consequences too. No one ever anticipated those. And then it becomes something that people have a mixed or even negative view towards. I mean, just think about, you know, like this thing here, a cell phone, right? uh, when it started off, everyone thought this was the greatest thing ever, and now we look at it as the this is evil that is the poisoning our youth and taking our time and giving us nothing in return. Uh, so this is true of anything we scale, uh, and we have this kind of schema, and we talk about it in the book, in which we want to try to anticipate as much as possible about what might occur, good and bad, from our scaling efforts. Because then we can focus our attention on those things and see if they are happening. But there's so much that we can't anticipate that part of our evaluation efforts of scaling has to be exploratory. We need to be looking into the world without really knowing what precisely we're looking for. And that exploratory component is oftentimes left out. It's very hard to convince funders that you need to spend time and money just looking around to see if something has happened that you either like or don't like. And it turns out to often also be like sort of more expensive to do that well than it is to do a kind of confirmatory effort. If I know there's a particular impact that I'd like to happen, I can develop a way to measure it or to observe it and to do that very well and focus my time on that. Right? I can come up with a good, efficient, effective way to do that. If I don't know what I'm looking for, I'm I'm looking everywhere. It's not cost efficient. Right. So you have to put that effort in. And I think that's really the critical component is first anticipating as much as you can. And then when have an exploratory element to deal with what hasn't been anticipated. So in the anticipation part, I mean, we have a kind of schema for that where we think about it, which probably don't need to go into in detail right now. But in the book, we mention it. We call it the DIA model, which is about identifying what's desirable, what's intended, and then there's what's anticipated, and thinking about how those pieces fit together and how you look at various combinations of those. Something that's desirable and intended and is obviously anticipated because it's desirable and intended. Like that's confirmatory. You know how to deal with that. But something that's undesirable, unanticipated, wasn't intended. Okay. Like, how do you find that? You're only going to get that by exploring the world around you in this rather inefficient way.
Absolutely. And I'm really appreciative of your important insights regarding the importance of early warning feedback loops and these bidirectional relationships between these four components leading to a program result. And thank you for your insightful responses to my questions. Well, if no one else in the audience has questions, then I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for sharing your valuable insights. For example, with your experience of I'm sorry, with your experience related to program evaluation as founder and president of Gargani and Company, and also sharing your important insights from the book that you co-authored related to scaling impact innovation for public good, along with your valuable expertise as an educator and researcher. And thank you so much for your time today and educating us about scaling impact innovation for the public good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope this has been useful. And if anyone has any questions later, please feel free to contact me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so, just as some concluding notes for the audience, thank you so much for putting up this slide on the screen. But when you scan this QR code, that you can complete the webinar feedback survey. I've also posted the links. Thank you. I've also posted the links in the chat. This webinar recording will be subsequently available on Ava's YouTube channel. So thank you so much for attending today, and I hope that everyone has a great day.